Welcome. Welcome to this panel on collective bargaining and best practices for collaboration, equity, and measurable outcomes. It's my pleasure to introduce this panel. Before I do, a couple of words. We are co-sponsored by LIRA, and I'd like to ask the president of LIRA, Adrienne Eaton, to say a few words at this point about the association.
Thanks, Dan. So yes, as Dan said, I'm the current president of LIRA, which is the Labor and Employment Relations Association, the co-sponsor of this panel. The other panelists are past presidents. Maybe that's coincidence, maybe not, I don't know. LIRA is unusual as a professional association in that it brings together academics who study employment relations along with practitioners, whether they be labor, management, third-party neutrals, representatives of government agencies. We hold an annual meeting, well, actually technically two, but this year's main event is coming up in about a month and features sessions of interest to all of these different communities. In fact, LIRA brings together our perspectives so that practice is informed by research and research is informed by practice. We also have local chapters that are usually more oriented around practitioner interests. And we have industry councils, including one in higher education, which is actually the co-sponsor of this, this particular panel and works with Bill on the conference organizers, I think most years. Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld, also a panelist, actually manages the councils for LIRA, and he may have something more to say about them during his remarks. But they're an excellent vehicle for getting involved in the organization. So we'd love to have more practitioner members, especially from the higher ed labor relations community. So please take a look at what LIRA has to offer, and you can go to our website and maybe somebody can type it into the chat. It's pretty simple, LIRA web, L-E-R-A web.org, O-R-G. And please check us out.
Thank you so much. Also, I would like to say that this panel comes out just to contextualize of a book that's appearing in a couple of months called Collective Bargaining, Best Practices for Promoting Collaboration, Equity, and Measurable Outcomes. The panelists are all authors giving reflections in the book. The book, I think, has been, you have the link, you have a 20% discount, my understanding. But for more information about it, just contact the National Center. And I would say that it's probably the first time in at least 20, 25 years that practitioners, both and theorists and scholars from both sides, labor management, have come together to devote some attention to collective bargaining, how to, in fact, make it work better for all parties. And that's what the underpinning message on that book is. I recommend it to you. I think it'd be a very good volume. Adrienne has written a forward, and others, again, on the panel have written very intelligent observations. It's my pleasure to introduce the folks here today. I'm not going to give an extensive introduction. They're known by their scholarship, their work, their experience in the labor management environment over the past, well, many years. And so first we have, who will speak first, Adrienne Eaton, who's Dean of the School of Management and Labor Relations and Distinguished Professor of Labor Studies and Employment at Rutgers University, and again, President of LIRA. We have Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld, who's a professor at the Heller School of Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University's former Dean of Labor Employment at the University of Illinois. Tom Culkin, who is the George Maverick Bunker Professor at MIT. He's with the Sloan School of Management and the Institute for Work and Employment at MIT. I think it's the Institute for Work and Employment Research at MIT. I apologize. I know that Joel has been affiliated with that as well. And David Lewin, who is the Neil Jacobi Professor Emeriti, sorry, David, I apologize about that, of Management and Organization at UCLA Anderson School. He's past president of LIRA as well, and head of human capital and labor employment for the Berkeley Research Group. So with that, I'm going to ask Adrian to begin. One more housekeeping. I apologize. Remember to go back to your landing page to get back to the conference. And we'll have a little bit more on that at the end. Each panelist will speak for a short period of time, and then we'll take questions. So thank you. Adrian, please.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for inviting me to be on this panel. So I come to this panel with a kind of unusual intersection of expertise and experience. I think in addition to being a dean now, I am a former faculty union president who negotiated, I think, 3 contracts at Rutgers and a resolution to a unilateral salary freeze during the financial crisis. As already mentioned, I'm also a labor relations expert who does research on, among other things, graduate student unionization. I think there's a panel on that topic later in the conference that I will be looking forward to. My other main area of research is on labor management partnership and collaboration, and I've written books and papers on those topics, actually with both Tom and Joel. So my remarks will center on partnership and collaboration, befitting the topic of the panel. In my foreword to the book, I argue there is ample research evidence, some of it produced by members of this panel, that more constructive problem-solving approaches to labor relations, up to and including full labor management partnerships, are associated with better organizational outcomes and outcomes for employees too. My most recent work on labor management partnerships is in healthcare. And it's clear that consultation and collaboration with unions and employees has moved the needle on important organizational outcomes in healthcare, like service quality as measured by patient surveys, patient safety, the levels and rates of preventive care procedures, and many, many more things. So really concrete, important organizational outcomes. I have colleagues at Rutgers, Saul Rubenstein and Charles Heckscher, who've been working closely with K through 12 education at both the district level and at the state level to create labor management partnerships throughout New Jersey. Their latest research, not yet published, shows that districts with established partnerships have done a much better job at reopening and generally reacting to the pandemic. My guess would be that that result is based on a level of trust that has been established in recent years through working on, again, hard outcomes around curriculum, professional development, raising student test scores, and the like. Can all of this be applied to higher education? Sure. There's a famous Tolstoy quote that all happy families are alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So I'm going to try to apply that to labor relations and sectors. In my experience, every sector and most organizations think their labor relations are unhappy in their own way. Since we're all academics on this panel, we probably feel that way about higher education, that it's a kind of unique organizationally. But the truth is that while the environment may throw up different economic and political challenges to different industries or sectors, every unhappy labor relationship is probably not unhappy in its own way. Trust can be hard to come by, even in established relationships, and can break down when new leaders arrive on either side of the table. Union leadership can be dug into a militant stance as a matter of ideology. And actually, I think that may be more common in higher education, at least among faculty, than some other organizations. Most organizational leaders jump immediately to labor cost cutting when they hit a crisis. We saw that in the financial crisis. We saw that in the last year. None of this means that trust cannot be built or rebuilt and a new relationship established, but it takes leadership, commitment, time, and resources. And I know my panelists will be talking more about all of that. Are there other complications in higher education? I think there are, but again, not not barriers that we can't get over. I think those are primarily around the fact that there is a second bite at the decision-making apple that unionized faculty get through shared governance. So shared governance has to be thought about in terms of labor management collaboration. There's also, of course, intense hierarchy and wide education gaps among occupational groups in higher ed. And I think those are particularly challenging for staff and for staff labor relations. But we see that in healthcare too. And these are, again, barriers that can be worked around, jumped over with the right kind of commitments. Let me jump down to some benefits to partnership approach besides the kind of outcomes that I mentioned before. I think bringing unions and employees into decision-making processes can often soften up resistance to organizational change. It's a reason why some union leaders are really suspicious about partnership or collaboration. But it's clearly a benefit for the organization at times. And I certainly experienced this dynamic more than once as union president. And I describe an example of that in the foreword in the book. Unions can also be really powerful allies of the university in negotiating or working with state politicians if the university is in the public sector or even the federal government. Those on the management side may not realize the national unions that represent the majority of faculty maintain active lobbying efforts, and local union leaders like myself at that time often join in those efforts. I spent quite a bit of time in Trenton when I was faculty union president. We have relationships with politicians there. Academic unions and universities are often actually on the same side of public policy issues. I think about immigration issues during the past presidents' time period. Research funding, another place where we often are on the same side, or always on the same side, I think, and possibly student debt. So working together on these issues doesn't prevent either side from leveraging politicians and regulatory agencies when they are not in the same side, but it's an opportunity that I think is often not taken advantage of. In my experience, academic leaders, which is the audience for the book that Dan has put together, are often unfamiliar with the potential benefits of constructive labor relations. And I think the book is really sorely needed in that regard. Leaders may take cues from board members who are more likely to operate in non-union environments. Leaders often turn to attorneys, whether internally or externally, to help develop and implement labor relations strategy. While there are certainly labor lawyers who appreciate the relationship part of labor relations and who know something about the positive approaches I'm discussing and are discussed throughout the book Dan has edited, many do not. As I said to someone in my own university leadership just this last week, academic leaders need to think strategically about labor relations and not leave it as an afterthought, which is what happens so often. I think they also need to think strategically about their broader human resource management policies and practices. And this involves thinking more deeply about how unions and employees can contribute to the strategic goals of the institution, while at the same time respecting their needs and their goals. In my observation, higher education lags behind in both labor relations and human resource management practices. As some of the contributors have noted, higher education is under enormous strain right now in the face of the COVID crisis and under longer term disruptive challenges. There may be times when the interests of employees and unions are somewhat at odds with the college or university, but many more they are aligned. And I think Tom is going to talk about the kind of reopening and repopulating of campuses as an example. For many of you, I'm probably preaching to the choir. I think the fact that Dan's book is targeted to institutional leadership is important, and it's an impressive effort towards shifting practices in a positive and constructive direction. And I thank him again for asking me to be part of the panel and of the book. And I am going to have to jump off this conference shortly for another meeting, but we'll hope to rejoin panels later on in the day. Thanks.
David, the floor is yours. Oh, you're muted.
Let me get myself off mute. Well, thank you. Indeed, when I was first asked to contribute to the book that Dan has edited, he asked me a series of questions, and I wrote some answers to those questions, and I'm going to use those answers as the basis for my comments this morning. One question was, how does what occurs at the bargaining table limit the ability or impact the ability of university officials to lead and manage their roles? Well, it's important to understand that among all industries, higher education is one of the most highly unionized. Estimates are that about 40% of academic related employees, full-time faculty, part-time faculty, research assistants, librarians, for example, in higher education institutions are unionized, and this percentage appears to be even higher among other employees of colleges and universities, professional administrative staff, healthcare workers, maintenance workers, security personnel, and so on. So when college and university employees are unionized, collective bargaining agreements typically result from negotiations amongst the representatives of unions and university officials. And such agreements typically specify terms and conditions of employment, in particular work schedules, pay rates for specific positions, and changes in pay rates during multi-year agreements. And these are traditionally or typically multi-year agreements. Those agreements also contain multi-step grievance procedures that are intended to resolve employment-related disputes that arise during the life of the agreements. And as in other industries, the grievance procedure is a key feature of these collective bargaining agreements. So taken together, union representation and grievance procedures constitute the main channels of employee voice in higher education. Now, does this availability and use of voice impact the ability of university officials to lead and manage their institutions? And my answer to that question is only marginally, because without unions and collective bargaining, university officials can unilaterally set work schedules, pay rates, and changes in pay rates. With unions and bargaining, they have to do so bilaterally. But collective bargaining agreements in higher education typically do not limit university officials in deciding specific degree programs to be offered, the sizes of entering classes, requirements for student admission, student financial support, and many other related matters. So stated differently, the union impact on management control in higher education is relatively limited. However, such impact may be expanded depending upon the scope of matters or issues that the parties determine should be negotiable. So typically management tries to limit the scope of bargaining, whereas unionized employees attempt to broaden it. So for example, university leaders and unionized faculty might decide to negotiate over budget allocations, excuse me, to particular schools and departments within a university. Now, this is not a typical subject of bargaining in higher ed, but there's nothing that prevents the parties from including it as a subject of bargaining. And I'm going to return to this scope of bargaining matter a little later. A second question that I was asked is, what do the parties to a labor management relationship, including those who negotiate collective bargaining agreements, need to know about academic affairs in a university, department, or school? So probably the single most important thing that these parties need to know is that, unlike in most other industries, shared governance is a long-standing principle and practice in higher education institutions. In a typical higher education institution, there exists a faculty senate, of which all faculty are members or eligible to be members. University officials, together with the faculty senate, exercise joint governance over many key decisions, including about which degree programs to offer, the requirements for those programs, faculty staffing of degree programs, and much more. Now, these areas of decision-making are typically beyond the scope of traditional collective bargaining. However, similar to collective bargaining, a faculty senate limits the control that a university's leadership can exercise over its institution. So therefore, where a faculty senate and unions with collective bargaining exist, there's a form of tripartite governance, or as has been referred to in other contexts, multilateral bargaining, a phrase that was first coined in studies of public sector unionization and labor management relations, especially, for example, involving teachers, school districts, local government officials outside of school districts, state representatives, multiple parties to negotiations. So the answer to the second question is fundamentally, there's a tripartite form of negotiation when you have an administration of a university, an academic senate, and employees who are unionized. Next, I was asked, what would I advise the parties about the future of higher education to make collective bargaining more proactive, collaborative, and equitable? Well, I mentioned before that traditionally the scope of negotiable issues has been narrow. Management in particular tends to prefer that. But unionized faculty and administration could negotiate over the criteria by which faculty job performance is evaluated. Such criteria typically include research, teaching, and service, but they're specified by university officials in conjunction with academic senates. I'm not aware of any conceptual or empirical bases for limiting negotiations over those matters, and thus they could well become subjects of collective bargaining. I think they would advance equity in terms of faculty and administrative relationships, and non-faculty as well in some respects. Similarly, bargaining could be used to deal with the responses to the COVID pandemic, post-pandemic era that hopefully we are entering, and could also be used to deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let me briefly comment on one other question I was asked, and then I'm going to conclude my remarks. What advice would you give in general to presidents, boards of trustees, public officials who oversee the labor management process in higher ed? And that question made me think pretty hard about this fact. Most higher education leaders have risen through faculty ranks to become deans, provosts, presidents, and the like. Adrian Eaton is an example. Stated differently, such leaders have been promoted via internal labor markets that operate in colleges and universities. Hence, they are quite familiar with the research, teaching, and service activities that constitute the main duties and responsibilities of higher education faculty. The same can't be said, or not necessarily said, about college and university boards of trustees or overseers, who for the most part have not risen through faculty ranks. It also cannot necessarily be said of elected and appointed government officials who may have strong influence and decision-making power over higher education institutions, especially, but not exclusively, public colleges and universities. I would encourage these leaders at these levels to think of bargaining and conceptualize it as a cooperative endeavor rather than an adversarial endeavor. The general tendency of people who lead and manage organizations is to approach bargaining on a win-lose adversarial basis. And I think there's much evidence to suggest that the partnership approach that was referenced earlier is one that makes a good deal of sense, particularly in this sector. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Super. And my remarks are actually going to pick up on the themes that both Adrian and David have articulated. Adrian's argument for thinking about partnership and David's argument for rethinking the scope of bargaining. I will share just a few slides as images to go with the remarks. And I'd actually like to start with the 1975 collective bargaining stamp. Why do I have this here? Well, in part, this was a time when collective bargaining was a valued institution in society, so much so that it was viewed as appropriate to issue a commemorative stamp honoring the institution. Now, I've written elsewhere that institutions have to do two things. They have to create value and mitigate harm. And at the time of this stamp, mitigating harm was seen as preventing disputes from spilling out into society in disruptive ways. And creating value was seen as essentially building out a middle class in society. As all of you know, the years since have seen a decline in the percentage of the workforce represented by unions. And before I go on to what this might mean for higher education, I do want to do a quick unpaid promotional announcement. At the time of this stamp, there were many forums, the American Productivity Center, Work in America, and others like LIRA that brought labor, management, government, and neutrals together. Sadly, LIRA is pretty much the last institutional arrangement standing that does this. So when Adrian gave her encouragement for you to look at LIRA in general, and particularly the Industry Council for Higher Education, which is run in partnership with the National Center for Collective Bargaining in Higher Education, I've emphasized that it's a rare arrangement that is not part of the predominant polarization of people only talking to people like themselves, but actually bringing people together to bridge across boundaries. And that's where I want to go in my brief remarks. As David indicated, There are a number of basic assumptions that are on the table for higher education collective bargaining. And I'd like to start with the scope and the purpose. David already suggested that the scope of bargaining can and perhaps should be broader than just wages, hours, and working conditions, that there's many aspects of shared governance that can be within the purview of collective bargaining as a process, or collective bargaining joined with faculty governance in various ways. I also want to highlight purpose. Most people think of collective bargaining as a periodic setting of wages, hours, and working conditions, and it is important for that purpose. But collective bargaining also has the potential to codify past innovations and set the stage for future innovations. And that aspect of collective bargaining is underutilized, but I think powerfully important. And there's numerous examples of parties that have launched participative structures, innovative arrangements, in which collective bargaining served as a forum for innovation. And collective bargaining in higher education is uniquely suited to do that. There are assumptions about who should be at the table. Where you see innovation in higher education, it's because subject matter experts, not just a narrow group of representatives, are part of the conversation. There are assumptions about whether management rights should be off the table, or whether the conversation can and should include issues of curriculum, issues of pedagogy, and so on. That doesn't mean that it has to be an adversarial conversation. In fact, it needs to be quite the reverse. When we had the graduate students unionize at Brandeis, to their credit, they and the administration both articulated a shared interest in their personal and professional development and a desire for collective bargaining to help advance that. The very notion of collective action doesn't always have to mean either a strike or not. There are other ways that folks can work together to accomplish even dealing with difficult issues in ways that they might not otherwise. And ultimately, collective bargaining has the potential to be a forum that will have positive impacts on educational outcomes. And with that in mind, in the article that I wrote for the book, which was a delight to contribute to, I compared traditional bargaining with a more interest-based collaborative approach. And these were some of the things in a collective bargaining process that I highlighted. I'll just say a word or two about them. When you prepare for bargaining, traditionally, you set target and resistance points, and you get your constituents aligned to hold the line on hard demands. If you're preparing in an interest-based way, you actually want to put yourself in the shoes of all of the different stakeholders, not just management and labor, but students and others, and look at the interest, not just the positions that parties might have. Invariably, that leads to what I call a bargaining over how to bargain conversation, in which you discuss, should we have subcommittees? What are the ground rules? How do we deal with media? But in particular, what kind of conversation do we want to have? A problem-solving one or an adversarial one? Opening statements can be designed to open up conversation or to shut it down. And you'll notice that the outer boundaries around this are getting wider, and now they're starting to get narrower because subcommittees and different stakeholders are working together. And ultimately, it starts to focus in on agreements, but agreements that are designed to not just be a self-implemented agreement on wages or benefits, but also agreements for collaboration and continued work that will continue during the life of the agreement, leading to implementation and ultimately innovation. At its core, the argument that I'm making is that the institution itself can be shaped by the folks living within it. That what collective bargaining means in higher education is not written in stone. It's not bound to be done only in one way. And in particular, I would argue, David and Adrian signaled this, and you're going to hear this further with Tom, I would argue that there are multiple diverse stakeholders that are relevant to collective bargaining in higher education. And there is the need going forward to fashion this institution in ways that are multilateral, that allow multiple voices to be heard. The principle from Black Lives Matter of nothing about us without us, folks who are sitting down at the table to bargain need to create spaces for voices to be heard so that they can be taken into account, and the true potential of collective bargaining, not just to set wages and hours and working conditions, but to codify past innovation and set the stage for future innovation can be realized. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Tom.
Well, thank you, Joel, and all my colleagues. This is a fantastic panel, and I think we are speaking in a unified voice for the need for innovation in our representational processes, collective bargaining, and these more multilateral processes. I want to make 3 points in the brief time we have here. One is we in higher education are in an era of restructuring that preceded the COVID crisis, is going to continue long after the COVID crisis is part of our history. And we have to adapt our institutional arrangements and our negotiating processes to address the broader challenges that are facing higher education. Secondly, I want to, while I am a very strong supporter of collective bargaining in all segments of our society, including higher education, I want to emphasize the limits of the traditional model that we have inherited. And really my third point then will be, how do we address the issues around restructuring with a more multilateral set of governance and negotiating processes? I'll use the COVID, return from COVID as an example. But why do I say we're in such a period of restructuring? Well, we know that higher education is too costly. It can't survive as a viable institution with the cost increases that it's experienced over the last several decades. We have a tremendous problem of access for students without resources that need to be addressed. We are in a period of time when we're thinking about lifelong learning, and online learning resources are all out there. And we are transferring our teaching models from on campus, in class, using the virtual methods now, and with more online teaching. All of this is going to restructure higher education as we move forward, and it's going to continuously require much more engagement of all of the stakeholders. So I think we have to think about how do we adapt our institutions. Now, when it comes to collective bargaining, for all the reasons that my colleagues have already mentioned, it has tremendous potential, but it also has limitations. It has limitations in terms of the legal structure. There is a defined bargaining unit, and it separates out faculty from staff, from technical and clerical workers, and perhaps from the service employees that help maintain our campuses and so on. Everybody has their own bargaining unit. In fact, universities are a team sport. We have to work together to engage our students and to meet the needs and the mission for research and innovation and teaching that we all aspire to meet. The limits of collective bargaining in terms of an administration that says stay just within wages, hours, and working conditions don't work for faculty processes. That's why we have alternative mechanisms like senates, but we have to integrate those, and we have to think about the fact that increasingly our educational mission requires all of the research staff, all of the adjunct participants and professionals that are involved, that may be outside of a defined bargaining unit and outside of the scope of negotiations. And so as we think about going forward, we've got to bring our collective bargaining processes up to speed to deal with the broader realities of university restructuring. Let me just illustrate this and why I think we need to think about multilateral processes for the future of university governance by looking at where are we in this COVID process. All of our institutions, yours and mine, are now in the process of thinking, how do we bring ourselves back? Yes, we've done a combination of remote teaching, And we've pivoted to that. And I think with the help of an enormous amount of resources being put in by our administrative staff, our support staff, the information technology people to make all of this work. And it requires an enormous amount of now rethinking about how do we bring people back to campus? Who are the people who will still work part-time in hybrid ways? Probably most of us. And that's going to require us as faculty members to become much more adept at working with teams in remote and on-campus ways, teaching with new technology aids available to us, teaching perhaps new groups of people out there in a lifelong learning kind of mode, and integrating what we do with what the various part-time, adjunct, and non-tenured faculty do. And so these are processes that can't be worked out without engaging the multiple stakeholders that Joel mentioned. And if we are going to be true to the traditions and the values of our field of employment relations and the values that we bring from a history of collective bargaining, we can adapt to multilateral processes. We can bring staff in. We can make sure that their voices are part of this process. We can make sure that we don't divide up all of our engagement in separate bargaining units. We need to have processes that are much, much more fluid, much, much more fully engaged, use all of the problem-solving tools that Adrian and that Joel and that David all emphasized are part of the history of our field and part of the potential. So I see us as we come back, figuring out how we're going to work together with people working remotely, people working in hybrid roles, people working part-time at home, part-time on campus, and maybe part-time in some remote satellite operations as some universities are moving to develop. All of this is going to require a lot of problem solving. It doesn't fit with traditional collective bargaining divided up by separate bargaining units. It doesn't fit with an administration that limits us only to wages, hours, and working conditions. And it doesn't fit with faculty who think that they have the prerogatives to make all of these decisions and not engage other stakeholders of lower status and lower income levels in the organization. So we have a tremendous restructuring challenge and a set of opportunities ahead. If we use the tools of our trade effectively, we can develop the multi-stakeholder processes and manage them effectively to lead to a much, much more productive, innovative, and equitable and inclusive higher education industry going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a number of questions that folks have asked. So I'd like to start out with the first one, and that would be, in your opinion, the panelists, how would you recommend to the parties how they could accommodate social justice concerns in collective bargaining, particular as these concerns arise with the advent of organizing and negotiating with adjuncts, teaching assistants, and graduate students? And why don't we go David, Joel, Tom on that?
Sure. So, and as a matter of fact, one of the questions that you also posed, Dan, was the extent to which collective bargaining in higher ed could address matters of social justice. So on the one hand, there's a bit of an easy answer to that question, which has to do with allowing all ranks of faculty and perhaps even students to be represented in collective bargaining. That is a just approach to the idea of voice through unionization and collective bargaining. A tougher call, but one that needs to be addressed, is for higher education institutions to determine whether underrepresented students should become more fully admitted to, that is, represented in their degree programs, and relatedly, the extent to which students should receive financial support. Now, traditionally, these have not been matters subject to collective bargaining, but there's no conceptual or empirical bases for saying that they shouldn't be. And on the issue of underrepresentation, that is really a matter that I think is mismanaged if it is determined unilaterally by university administrators. In California in particular, but also elsewhere, for example, DEI has tended to be defined by university administrators and officials, and other groups on campus have somewhat different views of DEI. Collective bargaining is a way to have those other voices heard. So I think bargaining has its applications to and implications for issues of social justice on campus.
I'd like to further elaborate. First, let me say that there's a national negotiations going on in the healthcare industry, and one of the major healthcare systems, in which one of their subcommittees is devoted to racial justice in healthcare. And I would argue that if you are in collective bargaining, you can and should be setting up subcommittees to develop language and to explore ways to address issues of social justice broadly defined as part of your collective bargaining process. Other industries are doing it, and there's no reason why it shouldn't happen in healthcare. I happen to be elected to the Faculty Senate at Brandeis and serve on the Senate Council. We've done our own self-interrogation on issues of racial justice and others. And I will say that we just created last year a non-voting seat in this Faculty Senate for union represented groups that are not able to be on the faculty as part-time and contingent faculty, arguing that what the Senate does and what they do in collective bargaining ought to be joined at the hip. And so that line of communications is open and advancing, and especially on issues of the status, the career paths, the opportunities for non-tenure track faculty. Simply put, across the campus, we've done a series of focus groups, and the conditions vary enormously by colleges and parts of the campus. And the stories, some of them are really horror stories. So there's issues of racial justice, issues around gender, going back to the MIT gender study that Lottie Balin did, and LGBTQ issues, and then these core two-tier status issues in higher education. And really, when we talk about this platform being a platform for innovation, we talked about being hard on the issues, not each other. These are the issues in which we need to be hard, not just doing superficial kinds of agreements, but substantive agreements that lead to measurable outcomes that make a difference in the lived experience of folks in higher education. And the last thing that I'll say is that I've been doing a lot of work with the National Science Foundation around initiatives to broaden participation in science and engineering. And the institutional barriers are many, but in fact, the resolve at the highest levels in Congress and in federal agencies to open up not just STEM fields, although clearly STEM fields, but broader participation in science, social science, and humanities to better reflect society. The resolve is there. It's up to us to be creative and innovative in how we take up the opportunity.
Let me just add briefly to what both David and Joel said. Yes, we can use collective bargaining to address social justice issues. Yes, we can open up new seats at the table to groups that are left out, like adjuncts in our senates, if that's the governance structure. But I think we have to go beyond that. And it just illustrates the point I made earlier, the conceptual point. Social justice is important to every stakeholder in a university. It isn't just a faculty issue. It isn't just a staff issue. It isn't just an administration issue. It involves all of us, and we all have our warts and our blind spots, and we all have resources that we can bring to the table. So if we are going to address social justice, whether it's gender, race, other issues of concern, these have to be discussed in an open way, with all the parties having an opportunity to provide input, to provide resources, to criticize, to have a voice. As I think Joel used the phrase of Black Lives Matter, is not about doing to us, but allowing us to be part of the process and have our voices heard. That's the future of universities, through to our mission. So we've got to create new councils and new multi-stakeholder processes to engage these issues together. Because if we try to do them separately, we will fail.
Thank you. Let me pose another question to you that has come up in the chats, and it's a question that I also confronted many years during my time negotiating, and that is, what do you advise the parties who may view collaboration, and this could be either management or union, who might view it this way? What do you advise them to move? You know, they may view collaboration as a sign of weakness, and they have a mindset which basically is adversarial. Again, it could be either side. What do you advise the parties? How do you advise them to move to collaboration when in fact their history has been more adversarial and their own memories have been adversarial, so that the people who are coming to the bargaining table have a very difficult time transitioning to a collaborative approach?
Let me take a crack at that one for a minute,
Okay.
Dan. So here, I would recommend invoking the concept of organization culture for participants in a university, whether they're a lecturer, whether they're a chaired professor, whether they're a maintenance employee, a police officer, a provost. If you think of a university as an organization, you ask, what are the norms, values, beliefs, and expectations of organizational members? If those norms, values, beliefs, and expectations are widely and deeply shared, you can reasonably say that this organization has a strong organization culture. If they're not widely shared, but deeply shared, narrowly but deeply, or the other way, widely but at the surface, you have an average organization culture. And if they're not deeply or widely shared, you have a weak organization culture. When someone says collaboration means weakness, that is a value. And it could just as easily be stated that collaboration means strength. And if you are a strong organization culture university where people share the norms, beliefs, and expectations, that is a conceptual basis for moving to a more collaborative process. And if you think of it the other way, if you say we have a weak culture, that is a conflict-filled, typically a conflict-filled organization. That's kind of the way I would frame an answer to that question.
Yeah, I want to really lift up David's going to core values and assumptions. Culture at its core is at these deep, often unstated values and assumptions, and that's where the change has to happen. But let me move to a very practical view of this. I'm going to share my screen. This is an example that I've used in training of an opening statement. It happens to be in a utility negotiation in which there was 14 issues. This is just 2 of the issues in which the union, I was facilitating and taking notes. So this were the actual words of the union leader's opening statement. And what I want to call your attention to is 3 things. First, you'll see that these are not demands, these are questions. He also uses the word we, and notice the second question, what can we do to ensure that our members are the workforce of choice? In this particular negotiations, management was expecting the union to say no subcontracting of our jobs, and they were going to respond that it was a management right to decide on subcontracting. Instead, the union leader said, how can we ensure that our workforce is the workforce of choice? I happened to have permission to go into the caucuses of both parties, so I went in the management caucus. I won't use their language, but they said, oh darn, now we need to tell the union why we would pick a subcontractor over our own employees. And the key thing is, the next 3 days of bargaining were a full and open conversation about workforce planning instead of a positional debate and counter debate that it would have been if it was shaped differently. But the thing that I want to highlight is that there's nothing weak about the union's opening statement. The union asked well-posed questions that opened up a dialogue on the issues. They didn't cede ground, they didn't show weakness, but in fact, they triggered a collaborative problem-solving conversation. And so for folks who say partnership or collaboration is a sign of weakness, I would actually say it's a sign of strength to have, a adult-to-adult problem-solving conversation on issues of importance to the parties, including legitimate disagreements, because there's always going to be common and conflicting interests that are at play. The key is, can you address those issues in a way that makes you both stronger as a result? That's not a sign of weakness, that's a sign of strength.
Let me use an example that illustrates the power of what Joel just said and reinforce a bit of David's point. When the Kaiser Permanente Labor Management Partnership, the largest in the country, was put together, the initial executive director of that coalition of unions that participated in that partnership and that advocated and promoted the partnership, Peter DeCicco, who came out of a tough background of union negotiating against General Electric for years, said, look, we're going to get out of this box that the National Labor Relations Act and Board puts on us that says we can only deal with wages, hours, and working conditions. And we're going to talk about anything, but we're going to raise it in the way Joel mentioned. We're going to raise it as questions. How can we address patient care? How can we address safety and health of people who are getting injured because of back problems and lifting problems in our nursing activities? How can we include in a modern way the environmental service employees in the patient care process improvement activities that we all care about? By doing that, by opening up with effective questioning and dialogue, the labor organizations increased their power because they brought new information, new ideas, data, and resources to that process of deliberation. So it's a false dichotomy to believe that by engaging higher level decision makers in more open processes like this, that's somehow collaboration that weakens the union. This is a new way of gaining influence on a broader set of issues that is collaborative in nature, because that's the nature of those decision processes, but it is empowering for achieving objectives that people care about.
And people who are participating in this session might like to know, based on what Tom said, that the head of labor relations at Kaiser Permanente is Dennis Dabney, a recent past president of the Labor and Employment Relations Association.
Thank you. I have another question for the panelists, and I'm trying to cover as best I can the themes that are coming out in some of these questions, and that is, given what the panelists have said about labor management relations in higher education, what do you see on the horizon as the biggest challenges to cooperative labor management relations? What out there, given the new administration, given also the issues posed by the pandemic and returning to whatever we know is normal, what are the challenges out there that you would identify, and what would you advise in dealing with those challenges?
I'm willing to say that there is not a university that isn't in, or a system, university system, that is not asking itself, what is the future of higher education? In part, COVID and the disparities that it's revealed has accelerated that question. But at a fundamental level, this 500-year-old institution is being challenged, as Tom indicated in his remarks, in fundamental ways in terms of the cost of higher education, in terms of the differential experience of people based on being first gen or not, or other conditions. And frankly, the private sector is coming up with advanced educational models that are competitive to higher education. From any direction, the institution is challenged. And I would argue, both Tom and David have heard me say this, when the word institution was first coined, it was in France in the 1400s. And those arrangements, like the monarchy and the military, had been around for 500 to 1,000 years before there was even a Western language word to describe them. They were so slow moving. By the time of the Industrial Revolution, things like unions, constitutional monarchies, and others came into existence in 50 to 100 years. I would argue in this post-industrial era, basic rules of the game, institutions in society, are changing in fundamental ways in 5 to 10 years. And so the heartbeat, the life cycle of change is accelerating at a very high degree. And what you hear all of us talking about with new forums, new ways of tackling broader and different issues, collaborative problem solving, in a sense, those institutions that don't figure out the new ways to operate will become footnotes to history, because other arrangements will happen within a lifetime, not across generations.
It struck me as Joel was speaking that the for-profit universities pioneered online teaching, and most of the regular, quote unquote, higher education institutions I'm aware of, the faculty in them, the staff in them, have looked down their noses at the for-profit sector. Well, with the COVID pandemic, many universities turned to those for-profit institutions to hire IT people who would help them with their online technology to deliver courses. I'm not saying that higher ed should ape for-profit universities in other ways, but return to the idea of organization as a unit of analysis. And here, the organization life cycle, which is what I think Joel was really talking about. If you do organizational life cycle analysis for American higher education, for most of its existence, it hasn't faced real disruption. It's been the dominant player around the world. And there's been a few changes here and a few changes there. The increases in tuitions tell you something about the imperviousness of this sector to change. Well, now, following what Tom has said and what Joel has said, and to some extent what Adrian has said, if we are in fact on the edge of a truly disruptive period to higher education, that is an incentive to look for new ways of doing things in all areas, including shared governance, joint decision-making, and voice through unionism and collective bargaining.
I think my colleagues said it very well. We are in this era of restructuring. There are all kinds of opportunities for learning how we can teach new audiences in new ways at lower cost with highly effective pedagogy. But we've got to be open to those kinds of changes. So I think the big challenge we all face in our universities is being open to change, because change is going to happen to us if we don't, and it's going to be costly for lots of people if we don't adapt. Now, I think we can do it, but we have to be open to new approaches, and we have to be much, much more open to diverse groups who are doing teaching and who we teach. So there's a world out there to educate, and we have to be part of that process.
You know, Tom, Google just recently announced that they were no longer going to require college degrees for certain positions that they previously required them for. Now, maybe Google is a one-off. I tend to think that it isn't. It only takes a couple of other big players to do something like that. And also, and this has a long tradition, companies over the years and decades trying to form their own universities. McDonald's did that and General Motors did that. Well, the Googles and Amazons of the world are doing very much the same kind of thing. And by the way, they hire faculty away from higher education institutions to help them do that. So our competition may come not just from other higher education institutions, including those outside the United States. They may well come from companies who are getting into the formal learning and even lifelong learning business and may take, to use a hackneyed phrase, market share from our normal higher education institutions.
I totally agree that we are in a state in which there are competitive threats that represent major disruptive potential for higher education. But I also want to point to the collaborative potential. I've been doing a lot of work around the open sharing of data in science, a different area completely from what we're talking about. Between 1950 and 2000, we counted 8 multi-stakeholder consortia on this topic. Between 2000 and 2020, we counted 97. People are reaching out and collaborating. I'll give you one example. We're working with HBCUs and TCUs, tribal colleges, historically Black colleges and universities, and Hispanic serving institutions to build out a collaborative cyber infrastructure format where they can do together what they can't do separately around cybersecurity, around data access, and a number of things that are important to give voice to minority serving institutions around research and data on issues of importance to them. It was a space of 1 or 2 years for this consortium to form a charter, to have a shared vision, and to be up and running. And I'm going to argue that in society, the ease with which people can come together in collaborative multi-stakeholder arrangements is accelerating. And so those institutions, it's back to the earlier theme of this panel, those institutions that can operate on that kind of multi-stakeholder set of assumptions will be the successful arrangements going forward. Those that stayed and hew to the inherited, narrow, rigid structural arrangements will become footnotes to history.
Let me say that there are also other panels at the conference devoted to some of these issues. For example, racial equity. There's a panel on Wednesday at noon that starts, and there are other panels that are covering similar topics. Let me ask another question for your observations. You know, there's a movement now, and the NLRB has changed to accommodate graduate students. There are unions of teaching assistants, adjuncts are being unionized throughout many areas. What is that going to do, in your opinion, to faculty autonomy, to departmental autonomy, to what has traditionally been the role of faculty with teacher-mentor relationships? Do you see changes there? What would you forecast as to what impact unionization among these groups will do in terms of delivery of higher education, of work within departments, and perhaps a bureaucratization of schools and departments?
Let me take that one on directly. I think that's the wrong question. I think if we see it as a zero sum, when these get organized, we lose as faculty members, the game is lost. If there's one message that we have conveyed here among across all of us on the panel, it's that you need to have all those voices in designing the future of education, and they have to work together. And so we can't ignore the students who are our teaching assistants. They understand how to use these technologies better than the rest of us. And they have been enormous resources in delivering virtual education over this past year. And so let's find ways to engage those groups. Let's work on shaping the future of education as a joint process and not see it divided up in these narrow bargaining units that are dysfunctional as hell. So I think we got to reframe that question in its fundamental sense and say it's our responsibility to provide some leadership and some welcoming of these other groups, and all parts of the university have to work together to shape this future of education. Otherwise, we will be in a zero sum, us versus them, but it's always going to be a different group. That's the them.
And just to illustrate this with a concrete example, one of my doctoral students organized the graduate student union on our campus. And he found the negotiation. Now, admittedly, our provost at the time was a former president of LIRA, Lisa Lynch, but he found the negotiations enriching and enlarging. They actually had dialogue about the role of graduate students in the institution that were generative. And so, yes, they bargained over pay and other things, but they also had opportunity to share lived experience. And far from being ossifying in the way that you're suggesting, they both would argue that negotiations was a positive set of interactions with cross-learning.
Add a couple of things to what both Tom and Joel have said, and I do comment actually a bit on this in my contribution to the book. So several sources indicate that a majority of the undergraduate courses that are taught in US colleges and universities are staffed by lecturers and adjuncts, so-called non-regular faculty. I sometimes advise friends and colleagues whose sons and daughters or other relatives are applying to college, see if you can go on a university website and find a line that says, here's the proportion of courses taught by regular faculty as opposed to non-regular faculty. When you have this development without any formal bargaining and voice, it leaves decisions like this strictly to management. And at some point, and we've seen this already, parents are going to say, look, if that is the case in colleges and universities, and if it's also the case that part-time faculty or lecturers and adjuncts get paid about a quarter or a third of what the regular faculty have, how is it that you're keeping raising these tuitions to the levels that they're at? So this is an example where not only the lecturers and adjuncts and the regular faculty have concerns that should be represented via bargaining, but so do the research assistants. And in a multilateral bargaining scenario, you have to have avenues for parents to have a voice.
Let me let me ask another question, which I'm again trying to distill from some of the chats. We hire administrators, and one person has asked, we have a new provost coming, and what do we do? I'm assuming this is a unionized context. What do we do to acculturate or educate, or however you want to phrase it, our new provost, number one? But there's a broader issue too, and that is how we hire administrators, what attributes we look for, what it takes to be accepted by the many constituencies who are hiring senior leadership now in universities. So what do you advise on for helping the new provost, but what do you advise more in general on how we might change the nature, or should we change the nature of how people are hired and what we're looking for?
Let me start this conversation. I'm sure that David and Joel will have thoughts, but let's go back a bit. In the 1960s, when our campuses were all revolting, as students we were revolting. The civil rights movement was very, very powerful. There were all kinds of protests around the Vietnam War. Who did the universities turn to? They turned to a bunch of experienced labor relations professors to come in and help out and figure out, how do you deal with these conflicts? How do you deal with all these tensions? How do you bring the parties together? And some of the most effective of the provosts and the presidents at that time did come from the ranks of people who had a background in negotiations, but a broader view of how you adapt them to universities, whether it was at Harvard, at the University of Michigan, at the University of Wisconsin, later even at Columbia, as David knows. People were the people who were brought in to take these roles were experienced in this process. We need the same level of training and development and facilitating and advising of provosts and presidents and chancellors today as were brought in that time period. And I think there's a lot of ideas that we're talking about here and that are in the book that will help to train the next generation of university leaders. But they have to be problem solvers. They have to be effective modern day negotiators using all the tools of multilateral and interest-based processes. And that's the future of how we govern effectively and how we lead effectively in university life.
Yeah, I think that's really important what Tom is saying. When I was a dean at the University of Illinois, it took 3 years, but we changed the tenure standard to give credit for cross-disciplinary and translational work. I cite that because what you want in a provost or an incoming president is somebody who knows how to change the rules of the game, to adapt the institutions, so a good question would be, in your past work, how have you innovated institutionally? Because we've inherited a set of rules of the game that are narrow and constricting. In some cases, some of them are actually powerful and important. And so it's not as though you throw everything out, but you want institutional innovators. And the people that Tom's talking about, Clark Kerr and others, were folks who didn't reject conflicting interest. They embraced the conflicting interest and lifted them up and worked with them. And so you want somebody who can have that kind of conversation, can be comfortable with differences, and out of those differences find accord. Back to that collective bargaining stamp.
And this is really pretty interesting, I must say. One other point I would add is, if I'm considering a provost, I also want to consider the small group or team that would comprise the senior leadership around the provost. So what kinds of people would a provost seek out to appoint as functional heads of IT, for example, or as deans of schools and departments? Because the idea of having a top leadership team rather than just an individual or a set of unconnected individuals, again, that's a concept that's got longstanding in the organizational behavior literature, and I think we should use it to the extent we can in application to higher ed.
By the way, for me personally, hearing this conversation, I've served as provost 3 different times in 3 different institutions. So it's very interesting, your take on it. Let me ask a final question, because I think we're going to be running out of time, which picks up on some of the themes. And if I've missed some questions that people have asked, I apologize about that. I'm trying to assimilate and put together some themes here. And that is, when it comes to innovation, how do we sort of encourage and incentivize innovation in an organization not known often for its ability to innovate, particularly with collective bargaining? What do you recommend for our university faculty leadership, the staff leadership, students and senior leadership to encourage innovation? And what, if any, examples in industry would you point to as being particularly replicable as best practices?
With apologies to my colleagues, because I have to go to a faculty governance meeting starting right now. Let me give you an example from my MIT experience. I was faculty chair for 3 years, a number of years ago. And faculty chair is a unique role at MIT. You're part of, we don't have a Senate and we don't have a faculty union, but we have 1,000 faculty members that you represent in some fashion. And you sit on the university council, the academic council that participate in tenure decisions. You get all the information on finance and everything else. And you deal directly with the president and the provost and the chancellor on a continuous basis. What that experience taught me is the way in which you have influence is you bring data, you bring information, you bring as best you can the perspective when they ask, well, what would the faculty think if we did X? You have to have an answer to those questions, not just on your basis of your own personal views, but by being engaged with the faculty and bringing data to bear and saying, this is what we can predict. This is where we can go. Here are some ways we can help bring the faculty along. You have to use the scientific process that we teach in our universities by bringing information, data, and resources to the problem. You can't just pound your fists at those tables. That's not the nature of those deliberative processes. And that's not the nature of the change and innovation process in universities. Innovation happens by convincing our colleagues that we have a better way forward. And they are going to be as skeptical of us as leaders as we know they can be. But if you show them the evidence and you show them the possibilities, then they can come along slowly but surely and be partners in progress. So I'm actually quite optimistic about this, but we have to bring different forms of negotiation using all the resources, using data, using evidence, using opportunities for the future, but not just think that we can negotiate on the basis of traditional adversarial processes. So thank you, and I apologize for having to sign off.
Let me briefly piggyback on what Tom had to say by saying that, of course, this requires people to be willing, even anxious, to rely on data. And our experience with the COVID vaccines and who isn't vaccinated, and our experience with the insurrection on January 6th, there's been a study of 420 arrested people from that event that showed that more than half of them came from the upper level professions, entrepreneurs, C-suite people, things of that sort. And amongst those who refused to get vaccinated are doctors and nurses. So the idea of using data in the way that Tom describes, which I surely second, requires an audience or participants who are willing to accept scientific data. And while we might think, oh, of course they would in universities and colleges, to some extent, it is a bit of a question mark. But I think the argument is of course, a very strong one for making decisions that are data-based, empirical, scientific, and so on.
So I'd just like to add 2 points to that. First, I've been doing a lot of what we call stakeholder mapping surveys for these multi-stakeholder consortia, where we periodically ask people about their interest or what's at stake for them as stakeholders. And so, both what Dave and Tom are talking about coming to the conversation with data, I think it's crucial to be able to say, here's where the stakeholders are aligned and here's where they're misaligned on this or that dimension. But I also want to add a qualitative piece to it. There's a group at USC that does what they call world building, constructing future worlds. The fellow who founded it actually developed the future world for the movie The Minority Report and for a number of other kind of science fiction movies to create plausible futures. And they have 2 very simple questions that they ask, which are what if and why not? And I would argue that another way to think about how to foster innovation is in these various forums that we're talking about to have some what if and why not conversations. What if in 10 years the university was fundamentally different and lifted up diverse experiences and was the heartbeat of innovation in our community? Why not have open access to knowledge and data over a lifetime? Asking some of these bold questions is a way of turning what might have been a traditional forum into a generative dialogue.
That is really interesting because people who have a backgrounds in improvisation, who started at comedy clubs and now run businesses that provide improvisational based services, they use the phrase yes and rather than yes but. Adversarial labor relations is usually yes but, whereas cooperative is yes and. And it puts a kind of a fine point on it. Dan, can we ask you a question? If you got offered your fourth chance to be a provost, would you take it or not?
Probably not. I think I lack the elasticity and resilience, and I think that the world needs perhaps. Well, let me just say this much: it would depend where and at what compensation. But I would have to also say that anyone who seeks these jobs has to be very certain about what they're walking into, because the jobs today are like the ocean hitting the beach. The waves keep coming, and you can have all sorts of ways to mitigate one set of waves, and then the next one hits. And then it becomes almost a point where the multiple constituencies are ripping it up. And I think the points made on this panel are superb in the sense of what to look for in administrators and how to deal with some of the change. And in fact, we know that in most cases in higher education, we've been sort of putting things on hold for status quo for the next year or two in most of our labor management contracts. And I'm going to be very curious to see what happens. Let me say, though, that this has been an extraordinarily wonderful group. And I'm sorry that Adrian and Tom had some other commitments, but let me give both of you, Joel and David, some final thoughts to make to the group. We end in about 7 minutes, I think. And so let me give you each a couple of minutes to finish out with what you might like to say, if anything. Dave, let's start with you.
Joel, you want to go first?
No, go ahead, Dave.
What to say by way of closing? Well, one might imagine in a more threatening external environment for higher education, one might expect to see what sometimes happens in industries that are threatened or where there are unusual circumstances. And that is two or more of the players, the institutions, decide on a joint venture, a partnership, or a marriage/merger. And I think the opportunities for certain institutions of higher education to respond to this new world will include examples of universities that combine in some way. It might be just through the joint venture. It might be through a series of them. It might be through partnership initiatives, or it might be through a formal merger or acquisition. And of course, we have seen these in higher education. Carnegie Mellon would be a long-standing example. So now we would be talking about leaders of two or more higher education institutions that would have to decide if this kind of new structural arrangement was something that should be pursued. In my experience, each university and each school or department within a university very jealously guards its domain, which is understandable. But in a circumstance like we have today, and that I think we will have in the future, this business of a change in industry structure, I think, is something well worth considering. I'm not talking fundamentally, by the way, about partnerships between US universities and universities in other countries. Those have been going on for the last quarter century. I'm talking about something more, actually potentially more fundamental.
Joel, before we go, I just want to thank, before we get to your comments, I want to thank Bill Herbert, Michelle Savarese, Kazim, and others at the National Center for being so helpful in delivering and helping us facilitate this panel.
Yeah, and I appreciate the National Center and its partnership with the LIRA Higher Education Industry Council, which has co-sponsored this session. So in terms of concluding remarks, I really want to lift up and build on what David just shared. You can find lots of institutional innovation in higher education in what we might call islands of success. So at Cornell, there were 3 economics departments, one in the School of Labor and Industrial Relations, one in Arts and Sciences, and one in Agricultural. And they each had their own independent identities. They created a virtual economics department that rose in the rankings because it combined the best of all 3. They didn't have to merge, but they created an entity that had standing. And that's just a tiny example of what I call institutional innovation. And as David suggests, it not only could be within universities, it could be across. I'm involved with the HBCUs and others to create, in a sense, a virtual infrastructure for data and computing. In this context, I'd like to share with you maybe a final story. And it's a story that comes to mind from this conversation. Some of you are probably familiar with a fellow named Dr. Deming, a quality expert. Today in Japan, they still give out the annual Deming Award, who is famous for continuous improvement based on data and root cause problem solving in quality systems. In the mid-1990s, it was arranged that I would meet with him. He was quite frail at the time. Sadly, it was shortly before his death. He was on oxygen in a wheelchair, but his mind was as alert as ever. And it was arranged that I might ask him how his ideas of quality and continuous improvement might apply to labor management relations, to collective bargaining and the related institutions. So I asked him the question, and he responded, as he often did, with a story. He said that he had just received a letter from a woman who thanked him for having had a transformational impact on her life. She said it wasn't so much that they changed the work itself, although the ideas helped her on the job, but it had saved her marriage. And that's the reason I share this story, because she went on in the letter to say that she and her husband were in a marriage, and this gets exactly what David was talking about different kinds of marriages, in a marriage where they were always fighting. And using these quality principles, they did some root cause analysis. They looked at the data. So they made a list of all of their arguments and said, do we see patterns? And apparently in the letter, what she said is the pattern quickly became clear. Whatever it was they were fighting over, the argument was out of proportion to those issues. So in good problem-solving fashion, they said, well, why is that? And then why is that? What we call the 5 whys. And when they got to the root cause, they realized that it was that they were both competitive people, that they each liked to win. And that's when they had the insight that saved their marriage, and that I think is relevant for all of these new collaborative arrangements that we're talking about, because the key insight that they had is even though they both like to win, what saved their marriage was when they realized that neither one wanted to be married to a loser. And so with that, I'd like to also thank you for the chance to be here and commend you in the work that you do together all going forward.
Thank you for all of you who joined us today. We had up almost to 150 people listening in, and it's a wonderful tribute to the panelists and also to the National Center. Thank you.
You bet. Thanks so much.
Thank you.